Welcome to the CHCH Newsmakers podcast. I'm your host, Rick Zamperin. We have two very distinct topics that we're going to talk about today: the mob and comedy. Now, they may be polar opposites when it comes to water cooler talk, but both have deep roots in Hamilton. And joining us today is Stephen Metelsky, a former undercover detective, an author and writer with the Hamilton Spectator and Hamilton City Magazine. Stephen, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Rick.
You have a very interesting perspective when it comes to organized crime in this city. We are going to talk comedy later on, and even some of your writings about CH's 70th anniversary last year and all the fun that this place has had for the last 7 decades. But let's start with organized crime and how you got to be an undercover cop and were investigating, these serious crimes.
Yeah, I've been retired for close to 10 years now, Rick, but spent probably the better half of a 22-year career working undercover as a supervisor. And also on the other side of the equation, it's called a handler, who, as a supervisor, you oversee and you're in charge of everybody's safety, and you're essentially almost like the director and the script writer, because you're writing the operational plan, you're in charge of the undercover, and you're in charge of the entire cover team, and you're kind of scripting that out. So it was really interesting work when I was right in the middle of doing it.
So you're kind of directing what other officers are doing within a project, per se?
There's only so much you can control, Rick.
Okay.
In an operational plan, you're scripting what you would like to see happen, safety plans, plan B to F. But first and foremost is the safety of that undercover while they're working in whether it's a short-term undercover operation, medium, or a long-term one.
Was this a position that you were up for, that you wanted to go for because you were interested in the subject matter, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, I have to say, like when I ended up delving into, later on, I wrote a book about undercover work, some of the men and women over the years who had done that, some high profile, some other undercover operations you'd never heard of. They've never been on the front page of the news. Right. But it's those men and women that did it. The Donnie Brascos, the Joe Pistones, Jay Dobbins in the United States, like they infiltrated the mafia and biker clubs. Like, it was always work I knew I eventually wanted to end up doing.
Right. What was the best and what was the worst part about it?
Was probably the sacrifice. Probably the sacrifice, because when you're involved in long-term projects, your personal life and everything outside of that kind of goes on by the wayside.
Takes a back seat, yeah.
That's right. It's like the huge proverbial pause button. The best part of that is honestly the adrenaline rush. Like doing that type of work, nothing I would say comes close to that. And it's so ironic we're going to talk about comedy, because I did comedy for 20 years. Right. I'm completely unfunny now. So
You've used it all up, is what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm doing knock jokes for my kids, dad jokes. Yeah. But comedy was, and sort of that improv background a little bit, was something, it was a catalyst that actually helped me get into undercover work, because you have to be able to think quickly on your feet. You have to be credible, believable, and it's about building that backstory. So that really also spoke to me, and it's kind of like George Costanza's two worlds colliding, like my true crime undercover world colliding with my comedy world. So back to undercover, that adrenaline rush, really waiting to get called to go on stage to do material for the first time, is probably the closest thing that replicates that feeling of working undercover.
Yeah. Was there scary moments or uncertain moments that when you're undercover, you have a goal in mind and something happened and you kind of felt maybe unsafe or unsure what was going to happen next?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the most interesting undercover operations I did, just to put your listeners and viewers in the shoes, I played the role of a convict, of a prisoner. It was for a murder case in Toronto, and there was another great UC involved. And to make it believable, we had to be handcuffed and shackled, and we were driving around in a prisoner transport truck all day. Okay. And it's like, you don't realize it until you're actually in there playing that part, playing that role. I'm not claustrophobic, but each little compartment, it reminded me of those old TV dinners where you open the lid and there's these small little compartments, one for the potatoes. And that's how I felt to use that analogy, which was an awful analogy, by the way.
But we get it.
But we get it.
Yeah.
And just getting thrashed around, and then, getting fully searched, and then spending time in an 8x6 concrete cell where there were no blankets, pillows, no TV. You're, on a camera 24/7, a little metal toilet and a sink. It really puts life in perspective.
Yeah.
And, the one thing, and I truly believe this, and a lot of people in and outside of undercover work have said some of the best actors and actresses aren't in Hollywood, they're undercovers. Wow. Because you do not only have to be believable, you have to have every, your T's crossed, your I's dotted, but you have to be in the zone and you have to play that character. And one of the things that got me through that was just getting in that mindset and role of who I was in that moment.
Wow. And all the while, and this is the beauty behind undercover work, or the necessity of it, is that no one else, even in the correction system, the officers transferring you, no one knows who you are.
That is 100% true. I will say one person knew, and it was the officer in charge of the station. But, when we were brought in one at a time to get basically searched, strip searched, none of those booking officers had any idea who we were. In those sensitive situations, you can only, the fewer people that know, the better. But out of professional courtesy, we had to let, obviously, the person who was in charge of the station. But I'll tell you, being on camera now is I'm comfortable. But being on camera in a cell 24/7, especially when you have to use the facilities. It's just, that's the reality, right? And, the one thing I realized after is it really does put you in perspective. And even though it was a short-term operation, when I literally finished that play, I was exhausted. And I was actually doing push-ups and dips in my cell like a real convict, a little bit out of boredom. I knew I wasn't going to get to the gym that day. But when I got out, I almost literally felt like I got paroled. And when you think of our correctional system, I can't even imagine or fathom, having to spend, even a month or a year in a cell like that. So it puts things into perspective, Rick.
From a mental standpoint, obviously there's training that is involved in this, but how strong do you have to be mentally to do that?
Extremely strong. And I'll tell you, not to be, this is just, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Day one of the training that I went on, even before the highly experienced instructors started the actual training, they played a 6-minute audio pack from a wire from a New Jersey undercover operative who got locked in the second floor building of a drug dealer's apartment and tragically was stabbed fatally. And, in my career, I've seen a lot of things, from minor to major, but I've never heard anything so dire. You thought you were listening to audio from a movie, but when you realize this is reality, and he was attacked not because the drug dealer knew he was an undercover. He was just a violent psychopathic offender and was acting out. And
so you knew what you were getting into.
We knew we were getting into. And after they played that, Rick, a couple people didn't come back after we took like a short coffee break. So you have to be, this type of work, you can't, and I've always said this before, you can't half it. You can't 50% it. And not even 100%. You have to put 150% in, regardless if you're on a cover team, if you're that undercover, or you're a handler. So I kind of had both roles, in front of the camera and behind the camera, without there being cameras, just figure of speech. But I honestly felt being a handler, because you're more responsible for the safety of that the cover team. There was more pressure actually being in the background at times, I found. Because when you're in the moment and you're the undercover operative, you're so consumed with playing the role, and obviously safety, and you're on high alert. But it's this battle between inner and outer voice. Like, do they know who I am? But you don't want to let on the outside. So calm and cool on the outside, but at times, and I don't care who you are, you're going to get those butterflies. And when I reached out and was researching the topic of undercover for my first book, it was really comforting to hear these men and women say the exact same, behavioral symptoms, how they felt, in their mind, psychologically, spiritually, mentally, physically. We all underwent the same symptoms, and even though the work they did far superseded what I did, it was just reassuring to know, okay, yeah, these are natural things, and if you're not feeling those, then something's wrong. But it's how you channel that into your character and persona, and that calm and cool exterior. That's key. That's key.
Wow. We've heard so much about PTSD and, thoughts about what happened to certain colleagues or even victims. How do you carry that? How do you deal with that?
I learned really quickly when I started policing in the mid-90s. I worked on a shift where, one of the first calls I experienced was an extreme call, where somebody had self-inflicted wounds to themselves. And, it honestly was the shock factor. And it was almost like they had a crystal ball back then. We're talking about 30 years, Rick. And we had, a total, they call it a debrief, where, we all got together once everything was said and done, and we were completely finished that call at the end of the shift. We sat down with the supervisors and had a debrief. And I think it doesn't matter what occupational role or what your status is, it's important to vocalize, right. Whether it's a partner, whether it's your colleagues at work, a good friend. A lot of places have built into their roles. If you look at a lot of police agencies and colleges and universities, there's counseling services. It's important to not bottle in, because as a psychology professor now, these are that compartmentalization will eventually rear its ugly head further down the road. Yeah. Like that snowball analogy of going down that mountain. If you don't deal with things in real time, it can just compound.
Let's get into the history of the mob. You've written extensively about this in Hamilton, from the Papelias to the Musitanos to everyone in between. It's such a complex and deep-rooted fabric of this community.
Yeah, and it's been around for so long. Like I'm just fascinated by the connectivity. We can even go back as far as Rocco Perry, like the king of the bootleggers, and his wife Bessie Starkman. When Bessie Starkman was murdered. Speaking about baseball, we're speaking about the Toronto Blue Jays. Yeah. She, at that time, Arnold Rothstein was the big fixer. He had mob ties in the United States. He had fixed the 1919 World Series. The word was then, and it's fairly credible information, was that Bessie Starkman owed Arnold Rothstein close to $200,000, and we're talking 80 plus years ago.
Huge dollar.
That's big bucks now.
Yeah.
Then it was probably 3-4 million, maybe more. Yeah. And when Rothstein, either he died or when he went to prison, that debt got assumed by the New York mob. And the one thing with the mob is, especially if you're borrowing money from them, they're going to come looking and knocking on your door, whether it's $20 or $200,000. Right. And when she was murdered, and then a short time after, Rocco Perry's kind of like our Jimmy Hoffa of Canada. All the theories, but one of the suspects in Perry's murder was Tony Papalia, or most people know as Papalia, which was Johnny Pops's father. So that lineage and the trajectory of the mafia in Hamilton, all the way back to Prohibition, and the suspected ties that Perry had with Al Capone in Chicago, and Canadian whiskey was in huge demand then. So when you look at the evolution in Hamilton, where it evolved into the three families, probably the biggest height of the mob in Hamilton was around the mid-90s, where you had three Calabrian-based, what's called Ndrangheta families in Hamilton. You had Papalia, you had the Violi Lapino family, and then you had the Musitano family.
And these guys are still around. Not those particular players, but their families and members of that are still in Hamilton, the GTHA.
Absolutely. I would say, there are remnants of the Papalia family, Musitano, but the namesake of the Musitano crime family. And I don't condone violence or wish harm on anybody, but I will say, a lot of these when you see the, let's take Pat and Angelo Musitano, for example. They grew up in the mob life. It was not just Italian culture, it was mafia culture for them, because their grandfathers were in the mob, their fathers, their
family
uncles.
Business, right?
It's a family business. So when you think of those early socialization years, they grew up, it was like ingrained in their being, in their fiber.
Yeah.
And same with the other mafia families in Hamilton as well. The Violi brothers, Dominic and Joey, their father was the underboss in Montreal at the height of the 1970s. So there's this, this cultural aspect to it, where probably not as much now, Rick, when you see, sort of the remnants of the mafia in Canada and the United States. A lot, if not most, want their sons especially to go into another line of work. Right. But back then it was an expectation that you're going to continue in the footsteps of your fathers, your uncles. It was almost like a birthright.
Right. So where do you see the future of the mob in this area kind of proceeding from here? Is it going to peter out, or will there always be kind of something here?
When we look at the mafia, Rick, and that's a really good question, because right now, the Violi brothers were released after a massive Project O'Tremens, and I think there's a misnomer. When things are quiet, we can't automatically assume or presume that the mafia is gone. That's exactly what they want. They don't want to be on the front page of the newspaper or the news. And right now is kind of that impasse. Like, the next chapter, the pages are blank. We don't know what's going to happen. But when you look at some of the powerhouse mafia families in Canada, Ontario's definitely at the top, and major Calabrian and Dragota families in the city of Toronto as well. So, the new trend, when you look at any traditional organized crime family, they have historically, all the way back to the Rizzuto crime family in Montreal in the 80s, 90s and up, they've amalgamated. I don't call it organized crime anymore. It's transnational organized crime, because all these groups, they don't want to fight each other. They all speak one universal language, and it's cash. And they feel, and this was really kind of where it started in Montreal, was it's easier to work together, pool your corrupt contacts, your resources together to make money. And the less killing on the street, the less attention from the police, the less attention from the media. So in Canada right now, obviously Southern Ontario, Toronto are the big hubs. British Columbia has become a really big hub. We see this evolution now of, the outlaw motorcycle gang, the Hells Angels. They've amalgamated, they've sort of evolutionized their approach to organized crime. They've partnered with South Asian and Asian street level gangs to form groups like the Wolfpack Alliance. And when you look at British Columbia, they are directly up the coast from Mexico. So for the last 15 years, even when El Chapo was out, these groups in British Columbia are dealing with drugs directly with the Mexican cartel. So a lot of street level violence out in British Columbia too.
There's no seamless way to transition from the mob to comedy, but we'll try our best here on the Newsmakers podcast, because as you referenced earlier, you were in the comedy and still kind of are, in the comedy scene, writing about legendary characters and individuals that are from the city. And Hamilton has had a wealth of really superstar comedians who have come out of this city. Is there something in the water here that just makes people funny?
Yeah, it was great. I was in this amazing building about a year and a half ago to do some research for CH's 70th anniversary and really to delve in, some of the coolest shows that have been on, and obviously the news broadcasts. And I'm wearing this today, my hilarious House of Frightenstein. Shout out to retrokids.ca. But one of the coolest things I have to say, I grew up being the biggest SCTV fan.
Yeah, same.
And I was an introverted, shy kid. And I really give all credit to SCTV, because I would watch all these characters as a kid. And, John Candy, the Dave Thomases, Martin Short, Eugene Levy, all Hamilton guys. Not John Candy, he was from Toronto. But, I reached out to Dave Thomas's agent, found the information. And again, if you don't shoot, you don't score.
Right, that's
right. But I didn't expect to hear back. And I have to say, he emailed me within an hour. We set up a half an hour interview. we ended up speaking for an hour and a half. And it wasn't me keeping him up.
Right.
And I want to share this with you because I toyed with how to open. I wanted to open with Dave's interview on Zoom. He was in LA with something that would connect us. And I toyed with the idea. You know, the late, great Joe Flaherty had just passed away. So I opened with me expressing my condolences to Dave about Joe. And I could just tell that really touched him and resonated with him. And we delved into some of the funniest behind the scenes stuff about SCTV, and I had a front row seat, and it was just incredible.
I was a huge fan of the show as well, and I didn't realize, because it was filmed originally in Toronto at Second City, and then after a few years it moved to Edmonton, and they filmed out of Edmonton as well. And it was the Edmonton years that were way more popular in terms of viewership than the Toronto years. And I thought it was the reverse, actually. I thought it started strong and then kind of petered out as some of the, the major players went to other things, but it was the exact opposite. And it was just the show that you had to watch because you didn't know what was going to come next, but you could trust on the Johnny LaRue's and the Smell-O-Vision and all these, amazing characters that just Harold Ramis and the crew kind of thought up out of thin air.
Yeah, and when you think of, the hub of Canadian TV, you don't think of Edmonton. But
right, yeah.
SCTV found their home there. Like, I even love I just watched the I Like Me documentary.
Tremendous.
It was amazing. And kudos to Colin Hanks and Ryan Reynolds. I'm so happy that they did that. And when I heard a couple years ago they were doing it, I was thrilled.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
So it was, and I knew this all along, but when I still see it, it makes me laugh. Just the TVs being thrown out of the balcony.
Of the apartment.
That was John Candy's idea. And, Dave Thomas had a great story about, we delved into probably his most infamous character was Bob and Doug with Rick Moranis. And he said they're in Edmonton, and, it'd be a long week, and Friday would roll around. Everybody would punch the clock. They're gone by 5. And Dave said it was, Rick and I, one camera guy and a boom operator. And he said we'd be, having a few of those stubby Molson, like for real. Yeah. Like they were in character. And I said, how many skits did you have written? And he laughed. He said, we had nothing written. Like we literally, before the camera went on, I looked at Rick and went, you got anything? And he says, no. You got anything? No. All right, we're just winging this. And he said some of this stuff, never saw the light of day. But they were really making back bacon. Yeah. They were really drinking beer. And he said every once in a while, comedy gold would strike.
Yes.
It's just great.
Tremendous.
It is.
It was such a great show, and obviously had a huge Hamilton component in it. And I think anyone from this area of our age that used to watch the show, and it's still, you can still find it anywhere, I think really gravitated to it because of, hey, he's from Hamilton, or she's from Toronto, or whatever the case is, and we kind of just fell in love with that.
Yeah, and Dave Thomas really credited Billy Van on hilarious House of Frightenstein. I remember myself too in the 70s as a kid getting up on the weekends and putting CH on and watching it. But Dave Thomas credited Billy Van, who is a comedy icon and legend, the late great Billy Van, and he practically played almost every character on that show. But that really gave Dave this whole insight into the vast world of character sketch comedy. And Dave was an amazing sketch comic, and the same goes with Martin Short, Eugene Levy. The one thing I found interesting on SCTV is they never knew when it was going to air. So they couldn't do topical timely skits, which really makes things difficult, because when you watch SNL, they usually open with something political that happened, in the last week. But when you can't go anywhere near the news or current events, pardon me, that makes it that much more difficult. Yeah.
Was there an eye-opening story that Dave relayed to you in terms of the early comedic history of his kind of career in Hamilton?
Yeah, like he really delved into the influence Hamilton had. Bill Lawrence, who was the original host of Tiny Talent Time,
remember that,
was one of his neighbors. Wow. In Dundas, very close to where the studio is today. And back to hilarious House of Frightenstein, he really was glued to the television set. I loved what he said. My family and I, every weekend we would have Channel 11 on, and I remember that because back in those days, You know, we had the rabbit ears on the roof.
13 channels, 12 channels. Whatever
Yeah, and one of them was Channel 11, CHCH. So I could really relate to a lot of that because I watched all those shows as well.
We have some awesome comedy clubs in the city as well, and I know you've written extensively about that. Do you have a favorite, or maybe a favorite moment from those?
I have to say, when I did comedy, 2 comedy clubs that really stand out for me, and I know one's in Burlington, but it started in Hamilton, was Comedy at Club 54 and ran for years and years on CHCH, and interviewed Ben Guy. The story for Hamilton City Magazine that's out now, that I co-wrote with my co-partner Jenna Humans, is we delved into the comedy scene, and Ben's been doing that show since 1992. It's
been a while, yeah.
And then there's this coolest club on King Street, Levity, and a good friend of mine who's a professional comic, Manolis Antanos, professionally decorated the inside of this club, and it looks amazing. And he's said, from Harlan Williams to all these, bona fide comedic talents that come into Hamilton and do a set at Levity, they've all commented that this is one of the coolest clubs ever. And it's not just comedy. It kind of creates this cool social vibe, because most comedy clubs, like the Yuck Yucks, great comedy clubs, don't get me wrong, but when the show's over, it's everybody exits stage left.
Right.
But Levity doesn't do that. It's a hangout. It's a place for people to just chill, have a responsible beverage or two, or a pop, and laugh and have a good time. So it's also a great social place.
Ben Guide, I worked with him for years at CHML.
Oh,
he had a show
kidding.
on CHML radio for years called The Ben Guide Show, Sunday nights, and he had such a unique perspective on comedy as well.
Yeah, Ben's a great guy, because back in the 90s when I was doing comedy, and Ben had the show which aired every week, Comedy at Club 54. He was really generous to us younger, up-and-coming comics.
Because he was in that place, at one point himself.
Yeah, and I always appreciated Ben, because he was there and had been there, but he gave us all the stage time to go on and try material. And I got up to doing 20 minutes back in my heyday of material, and I really have to credit that a lot to Ben, because he was just so generous with us up and coming. Mind you, I went nowhere with it.
I was gonna say, even so, like, you managed to get on stage, which I think is an achievement in and of itself, right? To get the intestinal fortitude to get in front of a crowd and try out a number of jokes or a bit or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And some of them I'm sure landed and some of them didn't, and that is really a test to your confidence level. How did you manage to convince yourself that you could do this?
It's a tight wire act without a net.
Yeah.
That's the best way I could describe it. I have to give credit and a shout out. High school, I always joke, because back then in the early 80s, it was a junior high, 7 to 13.
Right,
so I say, high school was a great 7 years of my life, and people laugh, and I say, I actually did go there 7 years. But I credit, not just the comedy aspect, but coming out of my shell, but my writing. The teachers at Loyola, where I went in Mississauga, were always encouraging of, my writing, and I'm a humble guy. But I really look at that sort of era in my life, that chapter, as the turning point or catalyst for not just having more confidence in my writing, but my buddies that I'm still buddies with, we call ourselves the Five Stooges. We started hosting talent shows at Loyola as MCs, and we literally were 100% influenced by a lot of the Hamilton comics, like on SCTV, the Martin Shorts, the Eugene Levy's, and we were building characters, and we were, building those into sketches. And just on a quick aside, we did that for a couple years. And after towards the end of the first year, we would do all these rehearsals and do our act at some of the feeder schools. One of the teachers said, "Can you guys tone the comedy down, because you're overshadowing the acts."
Oh, no.
People don't want to see that. They want to see you guys come back and do like an SCTV themed skit. So we got a kick out of that. And how do you tone down comedy? It's, I don't know. You want to ramp it up.
You're either in or you're out.
That's right.
You mentioned that you had written about the 70th anniversary of CHCH. Do you have a favorite story from the last 7 decades?
Wow, that's a really good question. I have to say, I got to come back to Dave Thomas. Oh, actually, you know what? I'm going to skip. I interviewed a mom whose daughter was on the last installment of Tiny Talent Time. And I apologize. I know the name changed over the years. Yeah. But the one thing, and Don Janescu, who's a producer here as well, I interviewed him for the story, was the early days with Bill Lawrence. And this is way before social media. Yeah. It's way before, the internet. And it really was a way for young kids to build their confidence, to come to a studio like this, whether they're doing, tap dancing or ballet or whatever their talent was, and then to leave and feel like a star, have a little party probably with their friends and their family, and then go to school and brag about it.
Right. I was on CH.
It was just so cool. And when I interviewed this mom whose daughter was on the show, she was on cloud nine for like a whole year after that. So those, little feel-good stories that sort of you never anticipate when you're delving into a story. And I think the history of CH really encompassed that, that whole idea of community and, building partnerships with people. And I think that show really brought not just kids, but families and communities together because I don't know, lack of a better word, it was just such a cool show. And now with social media and the internet, and it's become a little bit diluted because we have so many different platforms. So but those, I even look back on that show and some of the other great shows with fondness, because we'll never unfortunately be able to sort of revert back to that old time, those classics. So those are forever cemented in my memory, and obviously
and
here.
So many others. What are you working on next for Hamilton City Magazine?
Working on next? That's a really good question. Can I just ask you a quick question?
Sure, yeah. We're flipping the tables here on Newsmakers. Go ahead.
Hi, welcome back to Newsmakers. We have Sir, I keep swiveling. We're talking about the swivel
too.
effect.
I'm sorry, Laura. I'm sorry.
We have to do this in unison, but then it looks like the camera's off kilter or something.
What do you got for me?
Are you going to be in the November issue? I was speaking to my editor, Meredith McLeod.
I hear there's going to be a story, yes, on my rebirth, renaissance, or whatever you want to call it. My career pivot is probably more accurate. Yes, had a great conversation with Meredith, and that I hear is going to be in the November issue of Hamilton City Magazine. So looking forward to that.
Oh, that's great. I want to congratulate you on all your success.
Thank you. Thanks.
You had me on your old radio show, and I always appreciated that. So it's great to be here. And I was saying to you before we went live, I can't use that famous line I would always use, that I have a face for radio.
Well, I've had to shelve that myself. I'm not sure it's true, but I can't say it anymore. Do you have any advice to those who are either getting into policing, undercover work, or comedy? Because some of the variables that you are going to utilize in those two kind of workspaces are similar, yet obviously there's some differences as well. What would your advice be to them?
My best advice is get out there in front of people. With the technological age we are living in now, there are, and I'm not being a hypocrite. I have a phone, we're on our phones, but I've seen it as a professor the last 20 plus years as well. And I'm not painting everybody with that stigmatic brush, but interpersonal communication has dwindled. Even things like cursive writing have gone by the wayside. Spelling, pronunciation, it's all because of, the quick, let's send a quick text. Regardless of what career you go into, you are still going to have to 150% rely on your personal communication skills. You're still going to have to get in front of that panel of 1, 2, 3, maybe 5 people for a job interview. I was an introverted kid, and it really, comedy and SCTV as a kid, and then in high school, those were things I credit with getting out of my show. We all still have a bit of introvert in us, but being confident. And I love that old saying, you're never going to score if you don't shoot. Don't be afraid to fail. Failure is a building block. It gives you a unique insight into that experience that you can use as leverage to build yourself or improve yourself. And comedy is a great example of that. I'll share a really quick story with you, because I still remember seeing Jim Carrey, who was inducted in the Comedy Hall of Fame in Hamilton last year. The great Jim Carrey. His first time doing comedy was at Yuck Yucks in Toronto. And I think he was 17. And he said when he was on stage, the MC must have had a microphone behind the stage, because every 10 seconds, you would just hear this loud voice, totally boring, totally boring.
Wow.
And he found it so distracting, but he plowed ahead and persevered and got through it.
Yeah.
I'm not making this up. My first time on stage, I was about 19 or 20, was at the very same Yuck Yucks in Toronto. It took a long time to get on the open mic list. Yeah. Here I was, Rick, nervous as heck. I mean, you try the material out with friends.
Sure. Yeah.
You try to fine tune it, but nothing is more fearful than getting on stage. First 30 seconds into my act, it might have been the same guy.
No way.
I hear a voice on the microphone.
Boring.
Totally boring. And again, I persevered, fought through it. It was extremely distracting.
Yeah.
But I take that sort of small little nugget of a story, and don't be distracted or discouraged by, there's too much negativity in the world. Yeah. We need more positivity. We do need more comedy. You know what I mean? And it's having the courage to get out there and try something new. Yeah. Challenge yourself. Step outside your comfort zone, because it could be a good thing.
Great advice, and looking forward to your next writings in Hamilton City Magazine. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks so much, Rick. It was a pleasure.
That's Stephen Metelsky, and that's our show. Thanks for checking out the Newsmakers podcast, and a big thank you to the all-star cast behind the scenes. If you like today's episode, click the thumbs up, hit subscribe, leave a comment. You can catch the Newsmakers podcast on chch.com/podcasts and wherever you get your favorite podcasts.